Hello, everyone. Thank you so very much for coming. And thank you, Veronica, for inviting Alex and me once again to meet your wonderful audience. Yes, we've been with Veronica in New City Library for 10 years now, and this was my very first gig there, even though this is a different lecture because time changed, China changed, but the ancient stories are still the same. You will see the opening slide. On the left, it's a flag of Communist China and the Great Wall of China. And on the right, believe it or not, it's the ancient synagogue of China, built in 1163, does not exist anymore. But you ever visited any temple of China in China, you know that it looks exactly the same kind of architecture, same kind of layout, different orientation. The gates are open eastward and the worshippers face westward because it's east and Jerusalem for them was on the west. So where we would be going and why? But first I wanted to tell you that we went to China in search of a Jewish story. And the stories we faced and learned and heard, and the stories we discovered happened to be so much more than we have ever anticipated. And we felt overwhelmingly blessed and nourished by this unique perception and value of Judaism that we discovered in Chinese culture. So sometime after we returned, I found this quote of a rabbi named Aaron Nankin that seems to be exact reflection of what we discovered in China. Judaism is a precious stone which needs to be discovered, mined, and delicately carved into an intricate masterpiece. And that's what the Jews of China did. I say of China because there are actually two very different narratives. Jews in China, like Jewish refugees in Shanghai that you know of, and Jews of China that probably were there since 200 BCE, before Common Era. They definitely lived there, were well established, probably from the 600 or 700, 800 of Common Era. So we will talk about these two different narratives. This map shows us our trajectory for tonight. We'll be going to Harbin in Manchuria, after Harbin to Beijing. From Beijing, we jump on a plane and fly God knows how many hours through Gobi Desert to Danhuan, very important stop on the Silk Road. And from there, we'll go to Kaifeng. That probably should be capital for any Jewish history pilgrim who wants to know about Jews of China and meet them there. It's still possible. From Kaifeng, we stop quickly at Laoyang, also to discuss Jews of China, and then to Shanghai. And that's probably the story that most of you know very well from Shanghai ghetto and over 20,000 refugees that were saved there. My stories of Jews of China, about Jews of China, all are reflected in my book, The Tao of Being Jewish and Other Stories. And it's available on Amazon and paperback and large print and ebook formats. So let's start with Jews in China, Harbin in Manchuria, the very north. The culture there that any visitor encounters sees this synthesis of Manchu and Russian cultures. Manchu is from Manchuria, and Russian Yiddish culture, this unique combination of cultures that not anymore, but just influences reflected in local architecture, in style, in style of even foods that serve in restaurants, of musics and customs. And the city of Harbin was appointed a UNESCO City of Music in the year 2010 as part of the Creative Cities network. It was a short-lived sanctuary for Russian Yiddish-speaking Jews from 1899 probably through early 1930s. And like most narratives, Harbin Jewish narrative has parts, chapters. And the part one is the beginning, a brilliant creation of what was called Paris of Asia, Asian city of music. And it was created from a cluster of small fishing villages because what does Harbin means? Drying fishing nets. It was just a cluster of villages. And part two talks about dark clouds of anti-Semitism and fascism and the Jewish exodus in the 1930s, and liberation by the Soviet Army in 1945. And in part three, I will show you Harbin today. Harbin was born out of free will business adventure and voluntary resettlement from Russia. And the Jewish community of Harbin wrote an absolutely unique chapter like nothing else in the history of our Jewish diaspora. Starting with the settlement of first Jewish families that arrived in late 1890s, Harbin Jews came at a particularly fortunate period of time. They saw their sojourn, their life in Harbin as new beginning, this free life, free of persecution, and when they can do anything and absolutely everything, and they did. And this distinguished them from refugees that we know all too well from our history. People fleeing massacres, persecutions, pogroms, like the Jews in Shanghai running away from the Nazis, but not in Harbin. In the early 1890s, first family arrives. In the year, it were already hundreds. And the peak of the population of Russian Yiddish-speaking Jews happened in the early 1920s. Over 22,000 Jews lived there. They were bakers and bankers, they were tailors, they were jewelers, they were dry goods sellers, everybody from every walks of life. And they built this city that with 2 synagogues, with hospitals, with over 20 different publications, from the journal about European fashions to the journal magazine about opera. They had opera theater, they had conservatory. It was incredible cultural explosion that was possible due to the wealth of new entrepreneurs. And how did it happen? The unholy godfather of this unique chapter in history was nobody else like the most anti-Semitic of Russian czars, Nicholas II, who hated Jews with a passion. He institutionalized pogroms. But there's always but in every story. In 1895, according to Russian-Manchurian Treaty, Nicholas' government leased the land from China to build the extension of China Eastern Railroad, so he would be able to create a Trans-Siberian cross-country railroad. As soon as the first railroad was built, just beginning, the Russian government realized that they need somebody to create business ventures. And then he remembered he has this nasty Jews, and he could kill both birds by the same stone. So he invited Jews to move to Manchuria. Take everything you have, your money, your families, and just get out, go there, and build main city. And they did. Some settled in small different cities, but most came to Harbin. It was not exactly the promised land. In Manchuria, the climate is terrible. Winters are inhumanly cold. And in spring, they have this yellow dust coming over from Mongolia. It's really dust storms, and when yellow dust envelopes every surface, be it human or animal or mineral or stone or everything. But anyway, for the Jews, it was beginning of new life. And then Soviet Union was formed. Bolsheviks won their civil war. So the defeated party, the White Army, tried to immigrate when they could. And they went everywhere. They went to Europe, they went to Singapore, to different Asian countries. A large number of them came to Harbin. And they brought with them this typical Russian hatred of Jews. So pogroms started, beating on the streets. In 1931, Russian Fascist Party was formed in Harbin. In 1931 was also the year when Japanese occupied Harbin, made it the center of their puppet state of Manchukuo. Japanese were never anti-Semitic. They did not persecute Jews as Jews. But for them, Jews were equal communists, so whatever Russians bandits wanted to do with them, it was okay. So Jewish exodus began. Jews went to any country they could get visas, be it Australia or New Zealand or United States, and many went to Shanghai. Then the war, World War II started. In 1945, the Soviet army liberated Manchuria from the Japanese. But commissars and Cavalier, or Committee of the State Security, they were embedded with the Soviet army. They had lists of people who still had Russian passports. And they liberated many of them and sent them to Soviet Gulag. What I did not mention, Harbin was Russian language city. All this publication that I told you about, all but one were in Russian. Russian was lingua franca of Harbin, and many Russian words still survive in local languages. But after the World War II, there were a few hundred Jews only left, and many of them were trying to leave China, go anywhere, but not there, because communists came in 1941. The last Jew of Harbin died in 1985. And then Harbin today, when the Chinese government realized that tourism would be a very good source of income. American or Israeli tourism, to be precise, Jewish tourism, they began to restore all what was left from Russian Yiddish Harbin. The Harbin Old Main Synagogue that was built in 1909 was reborn as a concert hall. Remember, Harbin wants to maintain its long-lost identity of the city of music. It became concert hall in 2014. Harbin New Synagogue was built in 1929. It's a large synagogue that 1,000 people could fill it, and it was reborn as Museum of Jewish History and Culture. There is the largest Jewish cemetery in Asia, and this, for me, this cemetery illustrated both individual and collective stories of one of the most vibrant Jewish communities in the Far East. And the graves there, they say it's about 600 graves, and the cemetery was moved in 1980s. And the graves had signs in Russian, in Yiddish, in Polish, and former vice premier of Israel came to Harbin in 1990s. It was Omer, Yehud Omer, and he found the grave of his grandfather, left small stone there. In 2001, Chinese government opens university in Harbin with the School of Western Studies and Sino-Israel Research and Studies Center, and they invited Professor Dan Ben Kenyon from Israel, from Beersheba University, if I'm not mistaken, to lead this Sino-Israel Research Institute. And Professor Ben Kenyon was announced to the public as the first 21st century Jew of Harbin. So it's quite remarkable. And now when we know everything about Harbin, and if you want to go there, don't go in winter. So in winter they have very beautiful ice sculptures festival, but they have international music festival, international accordion festivals. So they really maintain the strong identity of the city of music. So now we come into Beijing. The first who told the world about the Jews Jews of China, or Jewish communities existing in China, was Marco Polo. He wrote with admiration about Kublai Khan's great respect for rituals and celebrations that the emperor from Kublai Khan took part in with enthusiasm. And these rituals and celebrations were of Muslims and Christians and Buddhists and Jews. And at that time, China was ruled by one dynasty, which were Mongols, not Han Chinese, they were Mongols, from the end of 13th century through 1368, the 14th century. Then, a few decades ago, Vatican librarians uncovered letters written by Franciscan priests from Rome who were in Beijing during Mongol dynasty, and they described Jewish scholars and how they debated in 1305, 1347. They hold debates between the Franciscan priests and Jewish scholars, probably on religious matters. What else? I don't know who won these debates. And then our favorite, mine and Alex's favorite, that we learn from a Jew of China, Jewish woman named Esther in Kaifeng. In 1605, Jesuits come to China. Jesuits were coming in, their purpose was to convert the Buddhists, Taoists, Confucians, to convert to Christianity, but they also were explorers, historians, cartographers. And one of them, Matteo Ricci, left a detailed account and drawings about Jews of China. The first one he met, he had no idea there were Jews in China. Nobody did outside China. He met a young man that, according to Matteo Ricci, looked exactly like all pure Chinese people around him. He was dressed like Chinese. He was in Beijing to take part in Confucian examinations that were necessary to build a career in government services. And this young man was seeking this priest because he heard that this priest who believes in one God. And I believe in one God too, he said he was Jewish from Kaifeng, and he invited the Jesuit to come and visit in Kaifeng, and visit the synagogue, and visit the great rabbi. And at this time, there were already signs of erosion in Judaism in China, signs of creating a unique Chinese Judeo synthesis, because the synagogue looked like Chinese temples. The rabbi already had difficulties to find young men who wanted to study Torah instead of Confucian laws and Confucian writings. And he, meeting Matteo Ricci and being impressed with his knowledge of Jewish Bible, not only of New Testament, but Old Testament, he offered him a job. But of course, the Jesuit had to convert to Judaism, to stop eating pork. But surprisingly, Jesuit politely refused the offer. So what's the contemporary story? Between the 18th century and the late 1970s, when China, communist China, was open to the United States, open to the world, Beijing did not have any Jewish community. But in 1979, Leila Jewish community called Kahilat Beijing was formed. So this modern Beijing is a city of over 21 million people, and there are about 2,000 Jews in Beijing. But this all Jews, it's like Alex and I, like many of you in the audience, they're all expats from Israel, from United States, from England, from all over the place, and they really love it. Kehilat Beijing, it's vibrant. They describe themselves as vibrant and robust, reformed, very reformed communities that invited us to visit. And we visited during a festival of Israeli films that were packed at the tickets were sold out. People, not just Jews, but everybody who wanted to know about Israel and Israeli movies were coming. Chabad opened in 2001, and in 2010, this brilliant new building was unveiled. Chabad is very active as well there. The Alex's photo, it's a Tiananmen Square that most of you know from the press or from personal visits. And Beijing is confident, very modern, and with typical Chinese self-confidence, Beijing believes in ruling China for eternity. Beijing presents itself as an ancient citadel of China. But I want to share just a few facts about Beijing history. And by the way, name China is traced back to the first emperor dynasty, Qin dynasty, the 3rd century before Common Era, when the concept of unified country became a reality. And the land was called Cathay, you know, Cathay Pacific Airlines, which meant Middle Kingdom or the center of the world. If you don't live there, you certainly should be a barbarian. Beijing means northern capital. And Beijing became cultural and political center only during the Mongols, when in the 13th century, Mongols occupied China. Then in the 14th century, the Ming dynasty appears, and Ming dynasty replaced Mongols, and they built Forbidden City. So when you go to Forbidden City, that's built beginning of it was built in the 14th century through the middle of the 17th century. And Beijing at that time acquired the layout that we see today, that survive today. In the 17th century, 1644, the Qing dynasty comes. They were non-Han Chinese people from Manchuria. They threw out the Ming dynasty, and they continued to rule over China from the imperial palace in the Forbidden City until this dynasty collapsed in the 20th century. And here you see the Forbidden City. And you most probably recognize these lions, because these lions are right by the entrance to any Chinese temple, to any Chinese restaurant. And who can tell me, I wish I could see you, where is the lady and where is the guy? And of course, the mother, she takes care of the baby. See, it's on the right, and on the left, man is playing ball. And there you see their ears are down and their mouth shut because they work for the emperor. So they cannot disclose what they hear or what they see. That's why they don't hear, don't say anything. And this throne occupied by last emperor. And we were fortunate to meet the last emperor's nephew, who even painted for us. His professor was at that time professor of calligraphy in Beijing University and ancient history. So he made an art for us with a sign that should mean prosperity and youth forever and ever. And we firmly believe in that. And now, important chapter that I tell everyone, know before you go, everyone who goes to China, everyone who wants to understand the civilization of this country. cultural and spiritual foundation of Chinese civilization. And it's especially important for us aficionados of Jewish history, of sleuth, Jewish history sleuth, to understand what happened to the Jews of China. You have to know the basics of this cultural foundation. Taoism was formed in 550 before Common Era, and the headquarters are in Beijing. Tao or Dao, that's where the title of my book comes from, the Tao of being Jewish. Tao or Dao means the way, a path for self-knowledge, for self-discovery, for proper life. Taoism focuses on the world of the living. World of the living, yes, but controlled by the dead, by celestial immortals, the world of supernatural. And Taoist cosmos, Taoist universe is inside us, inside the human body. Gods reside in both inside and outside. Primordial element of Taoism is Tao, which from which all matter emerges. It existed before heaven and earth. It's always existed. No beginning and no end. And that's how the Jews of Kaifeng would be writing their history to legitimize their religion to the neighbors around them. They called the book Taoin. They would talk about it from Taoist point of view. There is correlations and correspondences in Taoism between every level of existence. It never was the only religion. It coexisted with Confucian, with Buddhism, with Chinese folk tales. White Cloud Temple in Beijing, it's headquarters of the world Taoism. And the way the temple is constructed, the architecture would be the one the Jews would adopt when they rebuilt their synagogue. It was built in 12th century, it was rebuilt in the 13th and 14th. It already would take the form of the Chinese temple. But if Chinese temple, the axis is north-south or south-north, over there, as I already mentioned, was east to west. Confucianism. It's not a religion, it's a family of tradition. It's based on teachings of the philosopher Confucius, who lived in the 5th century BCE. And a primary issue for Confucian became, the primary purpose was to restore and maintain social harmony. Sage ruler who combines political power with moral wisdom. That's why Confucianism was adopted by every ruler of China, including the communist government. When during the Cultural Revolution, the temples were destroyed, the monks were arrested and sent for re-education to specially created camps, Confucian temples survived because Confucianism really built the foundation for everything, for government bureaucracy, for administration of the country, for community, for family. It never was a religion, because Confucian was certain that human traditions alone are sufficient for providing people with moral guidance, with social values. In sacred space, if in Taoism it's inside human body, for Confucian it's family home. For Confucians, people cannot live life fully, live morally in the present without being fully responsible for the past, which means ancestors worship. And this Confucian temple in Beijing. And again, it's south-north axis, and there you will see many stelas with Confucian writings and names of 50,000 famous advanced Confucian scholars. Buddhism comes in China from India. And Buddhism was born in India in the 6th century BC. But when Buddhism is brought to China by the Indian Buddhist monks who traveled along the Silk Road, and was adopted by Chinese, but they, just like the Jews would do after that, creating a synthesis of what you like with what you raised with. They, in Buddhism, you know, your real Buddha, the prince, he left his family, his children behind because he wanted to understand the course of human sufferings. So it was impossible for a Chinese people to, for the Chinese people, this renunciation of personal identity, more importantly, leaving your family behind. It was unacceptable because of Confucianism, because of ancestors' worship. So Buddhist scriptures were translated from Hindu and translated accordingly to Taoist terms to reconcile it with Confucian values. And this Buddhist temple in Beijing, you can see. In Beijing, you will see one form of Buddhism, which is Tibetan Buddhism, and it's Lamanism. It focuses on Lama, on Guru, on teacher, on a teacher with capital T, on enlightenment and meditation. And everyone who comes to Beijing, I'm certain, go to the Temple of Heaven, 16th century of our era temple, which is not a temple at all. It's oasis of tranquility of this very busy, very noisy Asian capital, the capital, modern metropolis. And it's structured according to Confucian design and to Taoist laws. According to Confucian, human intellect should be imposed on natural world. And according to Taoist, the world is perceived as a square. Heaven is round and earth is square. And that's what you see in Temple of Heaven. This is where the emperor would come and pray for good harvest, pray for rain, pray for peace, or for the victory in the war with the enemy. And it's a central altar where everything is number 9 because its number possesses heavenly significance. 9 is the largest single-digit odd number, symbol of heaven. And this is where people do Tai Chi. They study modern dancing or ballroom dancing. And now let's leave Beijing behind, go to the Great Wall of China. Oops. Here it is. It's close encounter with the wall. And unfortunately, very few tourists come to visit Ming Dynasty tomb, which is near the Beijing part of the wall of China, the one that closer to Beijing, because this is where you can meet the first emperor of the Ming Dynasty. I have to tell you that I don't really like him. And as one of our Chinese friends, when I told him I don't like the first emperor who liberated China from Mongols, got rid of the invaders that were in China, Mongol dynasty ruled for almost 2 centuries. He said, what, you think he parked his chariot in handicapped places? So we laughed. But why I don't like him? Because he was not a good person. If he liked a beautiful woman at his court, he would take her as his concubine. If the husband protested, he was arrested and skinned alive. When the first emperor died, he wanted his favorite concubines buried with him, and the youngest was 11. So not a nice guy. But why we spending time with him? Because it was during his reign when he sent emissaries to Kaifeng, the center of Jews of China, were there already for centuries. And his emissaries told them that the emperor does not want you to stay foreigners in his country. He wants you to intermarry with your neighbors. He wants you to take surnames, forget about Lei Wei, and it probably was their Levite. And then the 7 names were given to them, and so they became Zhanko, Zhao. It's all were occupational names like goldsmith or Goldstein. So that's when it happened. And now we will start getting into the narrative of the Jews of China. We'll travel from Beijing to the Gobi Desert, to this place called Dunhuan. And this how the Silk Road was formed. And in red, it's the land routes that went from Europe through Egypt to Somalia, Arabian Peninsula, Iran, Afghanistan, Central Asia, Bangladesh, Burma, new names for the countries, Java, Indonesia, Vietnam, until it reached China. And the blue, it's a water route. Probably most Jews, when they arrived in China, they went through the water. So we begin the Jews of China story. And again, it was Marco Polo, the first to tell the world about the Jews of China. And now I have to tell you the secret that I hope you won't tell anyone. You have to promise me silently. That Marco Polo never wrote his stories, the travels of Marco Polo. What happened when after almost 3 decades of wandering, Marco Polo came back to his home in Venice, and Venice at that time was involved in the war between Genoa and Pisa. Venice took the wrong part of Pisans. So Marco Polo went to the army, he was arrested, placed in prison, and his cellmate was nobody else but Rasticello de Pisa, who was famous poet and famous romance novel writer, and also famous liar. So he became a so-called ghost writer. When they left prison, he was the one who published the stories of Marco Polo. He wrote it down during their time in prison. So how did all happen? How the Jews came to China? The Silk Road. Like all roads, Silk Road began in Rome. And the Romans just could not get enough of silk. And at that time, silk was made only in China. So merchants traveled from west to east until they were coming to the southern route branch of Don Juan, the southern edges of the Gobi Desert. And among silk merchants was a high number of Muslims and high number of Jews. And scientists place the time of the Jews' arrival in China even as early as the Han Dynasty in 200 years of BCE. And that's how the Don Juan Monastery looks like. And 1920s, French archaeologist Pelliot discovered the oldest existing prayer that were written on paper. The prayer was written in Hebrew, so the traveling merchant most probably already lived in China, because paper at that time could be bought only in the place it was invented, only in China. There's monks and travelers' caves in Don Juan. And now let's go to Kaifeng to hear the stories, to meet the Jews of China. Kaifeng is located in the Henan province, in the center of China. There are over 100 million people, but it's still one of the poorest provinces in the country. It's by Chinese measures a small town, just of 5 million people, but it was one of the largest during the flourishing of the Silk Road trade. It served 7 dynasties as capital, was very important city, especially during Northern Song dynasty, 10th to 13th century. And Kaifeng, I would call it the capital for Jewish history, pilgrims. But there are no guidebooks, there are no Rick Steves, no From Fora, you won't find it, that would present you with ready-made itinerary. There are no sites that survived in Kaifeng from this golden age of Jewish history, Jews of China. But you have to come there to find them. And now it's not as easy as it was for us in 2014, and listen to their stories. See here in the middle is our friend, our translator. And on the right is Mr. Jin. Does he look Jewish to you? But he is considered, he has very strong identity as a Jew. He brought us to this place outside modern Kaifeng, and he said, through translator, that this is where the Jews of Kaifeng who settled there during 10th to 13th century, they buried their dead for centuries. And indeed, he showed us this about few feet long, maybe what it was, like 3 to 4 feet, Alex? No, high, yeah, 3 to 4 feet high stela that proclaim proudly in English and in Chinese the first monument of Jews. And it has a menorah on top. And behind it, on a pedestal of cement, there was a massive 5-foot-tall memorial marble wall that constructed of black marble. And this wall will tell you the story of the 900-year-old history of Mr. Jin's family. Mr. Jin, even though most of his family is in Israel, was in Israel. Now he is, as I was told recently, he immigrated, made Aliyah to Israel as well. But at that time, he was determined that he should stay, and he should write flamboyantly and in stone the history of his family within the context of Chinese history. And the story is divided, as you can see on the slide, into chronological record and genealogical record. Chronological record gives dates, and genealogical gives you who was what. This family before, family disintegrated in the 1920s during nationalist era, but they were very prominent. Mr. Jin's forebear came to Kaifeng in the end of the 12th century, and he was not a pioneer by any means. He came from China. Oh, he came from India to China. But family rose to great influence and wealth, and of course it all disappeared with nationalism. And with this, Mr. Jin dedicated his life and his family savings to create this wall. And here we are in front of the wall. Every Chinese family has a book called Huku. It was actually the first emperor, the one who started building Chinese wall, who instituted it. It's household registration. This is where the head of the family writes who he is, who was his father, what was father's profession, who was his grandfather, what was his profession, and on and on and on. Chinese are Confucians, no matter they communist or not. And nationality. And people like Mr. Jin put their nationality Jewish. That's a very strong Jewish identity. If you look at him, you probably would not blame me if I ask, how did you know you were Jewish? And he looked at me as if I came, well, from America or from Mars. I said, why? My father told me, and his father told him. And we always knew that we were the Jews of China. In the late 1980s, officials came to Mr. Jin and took away his Hoku book. It was soon returned, but his nationality was changed from Jewish to being Han Chinese. And people who were like him, like-minded people with the same identity, they had the same. The book was confiscated, a new one was returned where they stopped being Jewish and became Chinese citizens, Han Chinese. But Mr. Jin was a very tricky Jew. He had a copy made and secretly kept in his house. And this copy then had another life in this black marble in the stories told by Mr. Jin. He told us to go to the city and meet Esther. And this is where his immediate family members were buried. That's what he showed us. We went to the heart of medieval Kaifeng, and we met this young, vivacious woman who called herself Esther, like a biblical heroine, because for her, this meant Esther was her idol. It means strength. It means believing in who you are. It means saving your own culture. She showed us a narrow street called Teaching the Torah Lane, and she told us that was, she spoke English very well. That was a neighborhood where Jews of Kaifeng used to live for centuries, to live and pray, because this is where the great synagogue of China stood for over 800 years. But now it's a site. She told us now it's a site of the synagogue, no synagogue. It's a hospital nursing facility, but something that they think used to be mikveh still existed at that time. And people like Esther, and there were a few hundreds of them, there are no exact estimate, we used to come in Jewish holidays and pray there. Chinese government this time, and now especially, did not recognize Jews in their country as one of the 5 official religions. And by 5 official religions, they mean Taoism, Buddhism, Islam, and Protestantism and Catholicism, but not Jewish. And Jews are not recognized as one of the 56 minorities. And it's not brought up by anti-Semitism. It's very foreign, the notion of hating the Jews, very foreign for Chinese, but because they did not meet the criteria to be called minority. So Esther is on a mission. She wanted to resurrect Chinese culture that existed before. She said that we lost our language, our traditions, even our bloodline. We are not recognized by rabbis in Israel as Jewish, but not recognized in our own country. But we are they. We are Jews of Kaifeng. Had a very detailed plan that she wanted to rebuild the synagogue, long term. And short term, she was educating every visitor one at a time. She brought us to the house, and this is where the sign is. It's probably the only what's left of the last rebuilt synagogue in the 18th century. And this was a tiny house where what we would call now facility manager lived. It was her family for centuries, forever and ever. They were charged with watching over all the rebuildings and all the fixing the buildings. So that was her ancestral house, most of her family in Israel, but she is still there. She is still in Kaifeng. She created the cultural center in museum. It was her own museum to tell the history of the Jews of Kaifeng, how they came to Kaifeng, how they built the synagogue, and she shows the drawing. This looks like Chinese temple. In the middle of the synagogue was main hall, with the hall of the patriarch. And like in any Chinese temple, it was raised in platform, surrounded by balustrade, and there was chair of Moses, and that's where the Torah was read at that time. Behind her, you can see on the left, we're standing by the doorway with a small plastic Israeli flag, is a black poster with golden letters, where in Hebrew and in English for visitors like us, Shama is written, Shama Israel. And she told us interesting story. During Ming Dynasty, remember the first emperor who wanted to show everyone it's Chinese empire, no foreigners? Emissaries came to every house of worship in his realm and told them to have a portrait of the ruler being in every house of worship, be it temple or be it a synagogue. But Jews cannot use portraits, but you won't argue with an emperor. So they did place the portrait above the entrance, but above this portrait, they placed Shama. So in Kaifeng, proudly said Esther, the God of the Jews was even more powerful than the emperor. When I ask you about other Jewish communities that came via Silk Road and settled in China, in different other cities, and she says, oh, well, they were small. We were the largest. We stayed here the longest, and we created our own records. And these records are 3 stone stelas that in Kaifeng Municipal Museum. They were in 1914, they were in 1915, and in 1918. I don't know what's happening to them now. And these 3 stelas describe the time when synagogue was rebuilt in the 1400 and the 15, 16, were 4, but one did not survive. This entire story, how 70 families came to settle in Kaifeng. And it's described, she was reading us English translation of what was written in Chinese, how Jews created this China-Hebrew synthesis, cultural synthesis, to melt with China, with Chinese people. And she said that Chinese never, ever hated foreigners who came to their midst. They didn't care. They would just describe them as people with colored eyes. So that was quite a story that we learned from her. So why synagogue did not survive? It was often rebuilt after it was ruined or destroyed completely by the Moody Yellow River. When Silk Road was no more, the wealth of Kaifeng was disappearing, the Jews melted with the population, but, said Esther, we intermarried only along the paternal lines. And we're more Jewish than you are, when we told you we're originally from the former Soviet Union. Because in Soviet Jews intermarried along maternal and paternal line, but we only kept the paternal line. They believed that that's how you preserve your DNA. According to her, she showed us the DNA results. It was an unreadable piece of paper from 1980s when 70 Jewish families were tested, supposedly were Jewish. DNA was found. He said, I'm more Jewish than you are. And she thought that these 2 cultures of Jews and Chinese, they're so much alike. They're the largest diasporas in the world. They have the same values of family, of education, and they have very, very strong identity. And from Kaifeng, we went to Laoyang. There were no Jews there for many, many centuries. And it was also one of China's greatest ancient cities. Laoyang is famous in Jewish history, modern Jewish history, because 3 stone fragments were found near Laoyang, and they were written in Palmyrian or from Syria style script Hebrew, which was a branch of Aramaic. And the fact that one of the Jews who came from Palmyra to Laoyang left a tablet, it probably proves, that he was not a casual visitor, but a permanent resident. And in Laoyang Museum, there is a wonderful collection made of famous 10th period tricolor ceramic. And look at these peddlers, bakers, merchants, and for me, they look with clear Semitic features, and they wear hats that identify them as foreign merchant. They could be Arab traders, but for me, it was a proof enough that there were Jews of China at that time. And I can't just let you leave Laoyang without seeing this most beautiful, the most prized in the world collection of early medieval Chinese sculpture. It's Longmen Grottoes at near Laoyang. So what happens to the Chinese Jews of China today? 2 organizations became very prominent in Kaifeng. One was from Sina Jewish Institute that actually has headquarters in Seattle. Another one was Shavei Israel, and both were dedicated to helping those people who consider themselves Jewish for centuries to know more about Jewish culture, about Jewish traditions, Jewish religion, and Shavei Israel, of course, dedicated to helping people to make Aliyah and Chinese Jews were facing uphill battle because rabbis does not consider them Jewish, so they have to formally convert to study in Israel. And because there were many foreigners, many officials to Kaifeng, meeting with people like Esther, who did not even need a translator, who is very outspoken about Jewish culture, about her resentment that they're not recognized as Jews, that these two schools were closed. All meetings for prayers, for celebrating Jewish holidays, singing Hatikva by memory, they were forbidden because these people who considered themselves Jewish became too visible, making too many connections with the West without blessing of Chinese government. But in 2017, Chinese President Jinping introduced revolutionary new era for China's hardcore atheistic regime. In 2018 was a year of intense crackdown on all of China religious believers. It was launched at that time, but Little Kaifeng Jewish Center did not survive. So the place that was considered former mikveh was just covered with stones. The site of Kaifeng Synagogue was completely ruined. Hospital still stands. All signs created by Esther were removed, and instead of signs promoted the government attacks and repression against religion, not Jews, religion, on the site of Kaifeng Synagogue. Esther had to leave her house. Everything she had there was destroyed. And now there is the Community Comprehensive Cultural Service Center, which actually is surveillance point for government officials. Photos here, not ours, it's taken in 2020, and they were published in the article Kaifeng Jewish Community Suffers New Suppression in the magazine dedicated to religious liberty and human rights, Bitter Winter magazine, published in Torino in Italy. And a lot about Jews of Kaifeng you can read in the special essays dedicated to it in my Dao book. Now let's go to Shanghai, Jews in China, and that's a story that most probably most of you in the audience know very well. But Shanghai has no ancient history. Shanghai means by the sea. It's gateway, always was gateway to Yangtze River. A modern Shanghai was born after 1844 Opium War, built on trade of opium, silk, tea. It became seat of radicalism. Communist Party was formed there in 1921. And a colorless factory town for too long. But in 1990s, this long stagnation period ended. And now Shanghai is typical of modern China. It's archetype of modern China. It's a city of action, burgeoning economy. It's a city that never sleeps. Shanghai Jewish narratives has 3 chapters. The first wave of Jewish immigrants came with was arrival of Baghdadi Jews. Not all of them were from Baghdad. They could be from Aleppo, could be from any place in Asia. They came with the British and they built many of the city they built business empires. The second wave comes during 1920s, 1937, and it's a migration of thousands of Russian Jews who were coming from Manchuria and later came to Shanghai. When Japanese especially occupied Manchuria, almost 5,000 Jews came in the 1930s. And the third wave that we know very well, 1938 through 1950s, Shanghai became safe haven during the Holocaust. Over 20,000 Jews became refugees from Germany, Austria mostly. They escaped to Shanghai. Japanese invaded China in 1937. They placed citizen of allied countries, like stateless refugees from Germany, Austria, France, Belgium, then placed in the they were in turn relocated to what we now called Shanghai Ghetto. By the end of the war, over 20,000 people survived there, and they left. After 1945, and especially with the founding of People Republic's Communist Party in 1949, they immigrated to Israel, United States, Australia, Hong Kong, and so on. Most of Jewish history tours that come into China, they visit Shanghai only. And this is the history, Jewish history, that presented to them. Like China saved thousands and thousands of European refugees. But the truth is that China had very little to do with it, nothing to do with it. China was occupied by Japanese, but Shanghai was a political anomaly. It was a free port. There were foreign concessions from United States, from United Kingdom, from France, but practically no government. It was the only city in the world that did not need entrance visas. And that's fact of being a political animal. It turned Shanghai into safe haven. So you showed, of course, the Jewish Museum, and I'll show you the building, the wall with the names of survivors that were saved just for the simple fact that on the other part of the world, not occupied by Nazis, occupied by Japanese, but the one city did not require visas. And this simple fact saved so many lives. You have to know other places in Shanghai to visit that would be memorials to the Jewish lives there. For example, Ohel Rachel Synagogue that was built by Jacob Sassoon, one of the multimillionaires, wealthiest members of Baghdadi Jewish community, but now it's Shanghai Education Bureau. So you have to know what's in it now, what the address in Google, and ask your guide to bring it. And inside it has very unique architectural features, marble pillars that flank a walk-in arc with 30 Torahs. Russian Jewish club building, it's now used by Music Conservatory, but it was Jewish club. This is where the birth of the State of Israel was announced. And so if you know where Music Conservatory is, you will find Russian Jewish club building found by Zionists. The Jewish influence on Shanghai music scene is arguably probably greater than in any other places. And Shanghai Institute of ENT, Ear, Nose, and Throat, it was Bnai Bris Polytechnic that was founded by a refugee from Berlin, Max Steinman. There was one person that made a difference when so many others looked away. It was Chinese, he was first Chinese ambassador in Berlin, but then he became a consul, Chinese consul in Vienna during World War II. And he was issuing one exit visa from, but he was in Berlin, he was issuing exit visas from Berlin, helping people to get to Shanghai. He was issuing exit visas from Vienna. And he probably saved more than 3,000 Jews. He risked his own life, his career. The photograph you see was given to me by his daughter, Manil Ho. She was instrumental in placing memorial signs in the place where used to be the Chinese consulate in Vienna. You can see it on the left of this slide. And there is also a plaque with the name of Dr. Fan Shanho and his statue in the Shanghai Jewish Refugee Museum. And during COVID, there was one bright spot. In Vienna, they opened up the exhibit about Jews in Vienna Viennese Jews in Vienna. There was Little Vienna in Shanghai. It was wonderful. I have a book about it. Shanghai Refugee Museum was actually former Ohel Moishe synagogue. And during World War II, the synagogue was the center of religious activities for Jewish refugees. It's a great museum now. It will open today again after they installed new exhibits, new interactive exhibits. And this is place of Shanghai Ghetto and memorial to refugees in Shanghai and Shanghai Wall. It was unveiled as a Holocaust memorial in the Jewish Refugee Museum. First, it was a statue of 6 people that symbolized 6 million that died. But the wall is huge. It's 111 feet made of copper, long, 111 feet long, and names of close to 14,000 people who found safe haven in Shanghai is there. And during COVID, museum received large donations from few survivors from Shanghai. And here you can see donor Kurt Wick. He points to his family's name on the wall. He donated his personal book collection dedicated to Holocaust, to World War II, and to Shanghai survivors. And you can see people going through that. It's part of the museum. And my last few slides, I just want to know you the humble Jewish houses in Shanghai. There were Sassoons, Kadoris, there were famous industrialists, bankers, but also renowned philanthropists. And now it's a children's palace of Shanghai. If you know where Children's Palace is, this marble palace is the home of Sir Haras, was the home Kadori. Kadori still, a few of them live in Hong Kong, not Shanghai. But most of Sassoons and Kandoris and Harduns, his name is still famous in Shanghai. There are streets named after him. He was famous for his philanthropy and for saving Jewish orphans from Poland, bringing them to Shanghai. And his house is there. They have this whole complex, Shanghai Exhibition Center. So what can we learn from Jews of China? What I want you to take with you is, first of all, that the history of the Jews in China goes back to the 3rd century before Common Era. And there are 2 distinctive narratives, Jews in China and Jews of China. Then, very important also, anti-Semitism never existed in China. There was no word for Jew until Jesuit brought it in. So contemporary crackdown does not come from the government's anti-Semitism. It comes from atheistic totalitarian ideology, totalitarian governments based on total control of people's behaviors and people's minds. You might say, why it's such a crackdown on Kaifeng Jews when everything is destroyed, everything that supported their identity. And in Shanghai, it's flourishing, Museum of Jewish History and Culture. And the reason is that Chinese communists are not, they're very pragmatic. They realize that they can show off this history when China, they proclaim it China, saved over 20,000 lives. So, but for people like Esther or Mr. Jean, Esther is still there. The Tao to being a Jew is built on family memories of understanding of Judaism as a precious treasure. And they have what one of Jewish Chinese scholars, Rabbi Leitner in Seattle, calls persistence of identity. They have the strongest sense of identity, passed from generation to generation. And the response to Holocaust in China, it's part of my lecture cycles dedicated to acts of love and kindness. And so the story we all know very well. 20,000 refugees from Europe during World War II were saved in Shanghai, just because it was a free port independent from the rest of China, but the one that did not require visas. So you can read about China in my book, The Tao Being Jewish. My recent Jewish history and travel related books, we started new series. The first in the series was Jewish Travel Guide to Malta and Corsica. Now we live and breathe Portugal. We spent close to 2 months in Portugal researching this series of books. The first book was out. It's an illustrated guide, illustrated by Alex's beautiful photographs, to guide to Jewish history and sites in and around Lisbon. And the second one currently in the works, it's Evora and Alentejo, it's Central South, the treasure trove of Jewish history. It would be Shaland's Evora and Alentejo, illustrated guide again to Jewish history and sites around Evora and Alentejo. And if you have any questions, we stay as long as Veronica allow us. And please do connect to us. If you think of a question 2 weeks from now, my email is very simple, irene.shaland@gmail.com. Write to me, tell me about your own travels to China, what you learned there, what was your experience, and ask me any question, and we will discuss for as long as it takes. Then thank you very much for spending your evening with us.
Thank you so much, Irene. I just reminded everybody, if you do have a question, please go ahead and type it in the Q&A or chat. And if you're in person in the other room, I'll duck my head in a minute to see if you guys have any questions. The first question that came in, though, is what practices did they follow? For example, do they do like a bris?
Oh, I asked this question, Mr. Jin. If you are Jewish, what do you do? He said, we don't eat pork. And if you ever visited China, you know that it's very difficult to find a place where they don't serve pork. There are now halal restaurants, but it's not exactly glad kosher. We light candles on Shabbat, he said. We get together with people like us. And when Sinai Jewish Institute was there and Shabbat Israel was there, people would get together, they would study Hebrew, they would learn about history of Israel, history of the Jews, and Jewish Bible. She would sing Hatikva by memory. How many of us can say they can do that? So as Esther said, we lost our traditions, we lost our religion, but we're still here. We're Jews of Kaifeng. So what's happening now? I read that a year ago, in April of 2023, Esther wrote very troubling email to one of the people she knew in Israel, from Shabbat Israel, that she was kidnapped. She was picked up on the street, taken to a decent hotel, kept and fed there. Nobody said anything, without allowing her leave the room for 5 days. And she said, interrogated. She was asked about people she meets, what she does, and if she still has any Jewish objects, and then she was let go. Her idea was that she was kidnapped because she was going to meet somebody from Poland and somebody from United States. You can still come to Kaifeng, and there are people like Esther, but you have to know somebody who will lead you to them, and you talk to them. They're still there. Though many of them now in Israel and even serving now in the war.
All that remains to be said is thank you so much, Irene, as always. We appreciate you so much. And thank you, everyone who was here tonight. And I hope you had a great evening.
Thank you, everyone. Hope we will meet again.
All right. Good night, everybody.
I hope in person. Good night. Thank you, Veronica.
You're so welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Good night.
Good night.